Van Horn family had long been one of the most prestigious and respected in the quiet, sleepy town of Eddington. Their name was synonymous with wealth, influence, and a lineage that stretched back for centuries. Yet, behind the polished walls of their grand estate, a secret lingered, a dark shadow that no one dared speak of. It was the kind of secret that could ruin everything, and it was a secret that had been passed down through generations, as much a part of the family as the blood running through their veins. The mansion itself stood as a monument to their success, an imposing Gothic structure perched on a hill overlooking the town. The Van Horns lived in a world of privilege, a world where appearances were everything, and every whisper of scandal was crushed beneath the weight of their reputation. But deep inside the heart of the mansion, behind hidden doors and locked cabinets, lay a curse that no one dared confront. For years the townspeople spoke of strange happenings at the Van Horn estate, odd sounds in the night, mysterious figures seen wandering the grounds, and the inexplicable disappearance of several family members. But no one dared to approach the family with these questions. The Van Horns were untouchable, their secrets buried beneath layers of wealth and influence. It wasn't until the youngest member of the family, Alice Van Horn, came of age, that the truth began to surface. Alice, unlike the others before her, had always been curious. She had a keen sense of perception, a sharp eye for detail that often made others uncomfortable. She was the one who started asking questions. She was the one who stumbled upon the truth. It began one afternoon, when Alice was exploring the mansion's library, a place she often found solace in. The smell of old books and polished wood filled the air as she combed through the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of volumes long forgotten. Her eyes fell upon an old, dusty journal, hidden away behind a row of books. It was bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age. It seemed out of place, almost as though it had been deliberately hidden from view. Alice couldn't resist the pull of the journal. She carefully opened it, and as her eyes scanned the first page, she felt a chill creep down her spine. The handwriting was elegant, yet unsettling. It was a family history, but not the kind of history she had been taught to believe. No, this history was far darker. As she read, Alice discovered the terrible truth. The Van Horn bloodline was cursed, doomed from the very beginning by a series of horrific choices made by her ancestors. The journal spoke of an ancient pact made by the first Van Horn patriarch, a deal with an entity whose name had been erased from history. In exchange for wealth and power, the family was bound by an unbreakable curse. Each generation was fated to face tragedy, loss, and unimaginable horror. The curse had taken its toll over the centuries, with each new heir of the Van Horn family unknowingly carrying the weight of their ancestors' sins. And now, it seemed, Alice was the next to inherit this dark legacy. The more Alice read, the more she understood the depth of the curse. Her family's power, their wealth, their status, it had all come at a price. The very mansion that had once been a symbol of their success was now a prison, a place where the shadows of the past could not be escaped. Every member of the Van Horn family who tried to break free from the curse had met a grisly end, their lives cut short by unnatural causes. But Alice was different. She wasn't willing to let the past dictate her future. With the journal in hand, Alice sought out the truth from the only person who might know more, her grandfather, Theodore Van Horn. Theodore had always been a man of mystery, his sharp eyes hiding secrets of his own. He was the last living member of the family who had been around long enough to witness the darker side of the Van Horn legacy, and it was to him that Alice turned for answers. The night she visited him, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the mansion. Theodore sat by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He had known this day would come, and he was not surprised when Alice placed the journal before him. His expression darkened, and for the first time in many years, a look of fear crossed his face. "The curse," Alice said, her voice trembling. "It's real, isn't it?" Theodore's lips parted, but no words came. He stared at her for a long moment, as though weighing the decision to speak. Finally he sighed, a heavy, resigned sound that seemed to carry the weight of generations of suffering. "You should never have read that journal, Alice," he muttered. "The Van Horns have always carried this burden. It's a bloodline tainted by greed, ambition, and a dark, twisted pact. There's no escape from it." Alice's heart raced. She had known something was wrong with her family, but hearing it confirmed by her own grandfather sent a wave of dread through her. She had always felt different from the rest of the family, distant, isolated. Now she understood what the curse can't be broken. "Alice," Theodore continued, his voice low and sorrowful, "every Van Horn who has tried to escape it has died in the most horrible of ways. You'll never be free. No one will." But Alice refused to accept this fate. She was determined to uncover the full extent of the curse and find a way to break it, to save herself and her family from the horrors that had plagued them for centuries. And so, with her grandfather's warnings echoing in her mind, she set out on a path that would take her deep into the heart of the family's darkest secrets. Little did Alice know that the more she uncovered, the more dangerous her quest would become. The curse wasn't just a product of the past. It was alive, a force that would stop at nothing to keep the Van Horns bound to their fate. And now, Alice was the next target. Alice stood at the edge of the mansion's sprawling grounds, the bitter wind whipping around her, carrying with it the faint whispers of the past. The journal her grandfather had warned her about was still clenched tightly in her hand. She couldn't help but feel the weight of her bloodline pressing down on her, the burden of a curse that had been passed down from generation to generation. But she wasn't ready to give in to it. Not yet. There had to be a way out. After her conversation with her grandfather, Alice found herself alone with her thoughts, each one darker than the last. The journal had told her about the pact, how the Van Horn family had sold their souls to an unnamed entity in exchange for unimaginable wealth and power. Her grandfather's admission that the curse was real only solidified her determination to find the truth. She had to know what had happened, what her ancestors had done to tie their fate to something so vile. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Alice turned to the one person who might hold more answers: her late father's personal papers. Her father, Robert Van Horn, had been a man of great influence, a shrewd businessman who had spent years building the family's fortune. He had also been the last Van Horn to openly challenge the family's hidden legacy, although his sudden death in a car accident under mysterious circumstances had silenced any further inquiries into the past. Alice began to scour through her father's files, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was digging into a history that had been buried for decades. Most of the papers were mundane: tax forms, correspondence with lawyers, business deals, and investment. But as she moved deeper into the boxes, one particular file caught her attention. It was an envelope that had been sealed shut with wax. The envelope had no address, no markings, just a strange, unfamiliar symbol embossed on the wax. The same symbol she had seen in the journal. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, opening the envelope to reveal a letter that was decades old. The letter was written in elegant, looping handwriting, and as Alice began to read, a sense of dread washed over her. The contents of the letter were written by her great-grandfather, Elias Van Horn, the patriarch of the family who had made the original pact all those years ago. The letter described the family's desperate desire for power, their willingness to go to any lengths to secure their place in society. In it, Elias spoke of a ritual that had been performed in the darkest hours of the night, where a blood sacrifice had been offered to an unknown entity. In exchange, the Van Horns were promised prosperity and a future free of poverty. But what Elias failed to mention was the price that had to be paid, the curse that would plague every descendant thereafter. Alice read the letter in silence, her mind reeling with the implications. The Van Horns had knowingly sealed their fate in exchange for material gain. They had sacrificed not only their souls but their very legacy, and now, she was the one left to deal with the consequences. The more she read, the more Alice began to understand the extent of the curse. The letter detailed the terms of the pact, that every succeeding generation of Van Horns would be bound by the same fate, unless someone in the bloodline could break the chain. But the cost of breaking the curse was not something that could be easily paid. It was said that the entity would demand a final, ultimate sacrifice, a life that must be taken in the most horrific way possible. Alice's mind raced. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let her family's legacy end in bloodshed and suffering. She had to find a way to break the curse before it was too late. But as she read through the letter, another terrifying realization set in. The entity that the Van Horns had dealt with was not a mere myth. It was real, and it was still watching, still waiting for the day when the bloodline would finally end. The letter mentioned that the entity had been bound to the family's estate, its presence lingering in the walls of the mansion like a living, breathing thing. It had fed off the family's wealth and power, growing stronger with each passing generation, and now, it was hungry for more. Alice's thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the door. She quickly stuffed the letter back into the envelope and hurried to answer it. When she opened the door, she found a delivery man standing there, holding a small package. The man seemed nervous, his eyes darting around as if he didn't want to be there. "I've got a delivery for you, miss," the man said, his voice shaky. It's from a private courier. They said it was urgent." Alice took the package. Her curiosity piqued. As she closed the door behind her, she tore open the wrapping to reveal a small wooden box. The box was old, its surface worn with age, and it had no markings or labels of any kind. A sense of unease settled over her as she held it in her hands. What was inside? Without thinking, Alice opened the box. Inside, she found a small bundle of papers tied together with a red ribbon. The papers were brittle, their edges frayed from age. She could feel a chill in the air as she unwrapped them, her heart racing with the anticipation of what she might find. As she flipped through the pages, Alice saw the same symbol that had appeared in her great-grandfather's letter, but there was something else. Written in bold black ink was a message. "The bloodline is yours to carry, but you must choose. Break the curse and risk your soul, or let it continue and risk losing everything." Alice's hands trembled as she read the words, a sense of dread sinking deep into her chest. This wasn't just a warning, it was a decision that would shape her future, and possibly her life. The curse had already claimed so many lives in her family. Would she be the one to end it, or would she become yet another victim? Alice sat alone in her study, the weight of the small wooden box still lingering in her hands. The papers inside had shaken her, but they also gave her something she hadn't had before: direction. The curse that had haunted her family for generations wasn't just some figment of superstition. It was real, and it had a price that no one had been willing to pay. Yet, according to the mysterious letter, the curse was hers to break. The question now was, Alice had spent the past few days reading through the documents in the box, each paper offering a cryptic clue about what needed to be done. It seemed like a riddle with no solution, but there was one thing that stood out to her, above all else: the mansion. The family estate had always been the center of the Van Horns' power, and their curse. The mansion was more than just a home. It was the place where the pact had been sealed, and it was the place where it would end. Alice's heart raced as she remembered the letter's final warning: "The entity feeds on the legacy. It has been waiting for you." She knew then that she had no choice. She had to go back to the mansion, to the place where everything had begun. But as she prepared for the journey, a nagging doubt gnawed at her. The mansion had always been a place of dark secrets, and no one in her family had ever dared to uncover its mysteries. Not until now. Was she prepared to face whatever waited for her there? Would she be able to live with the consequences of her actions? Or would the curse claim her as well? Determined to find answers, Alice made her way to the mansion the following morning. As she drove through the gates and up the long winding driveway, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The mansion loomed before her, its dark silhouette cutting against the gray sky. It had always seemed imposing, but today it felt alive,
almost as if it were waiting for her. She parked her car and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The air was cold and still, a silence that felt unnatural. The mansion's towering presence seemed to swallow all sound, as though it had been holding its breath for decades. Alice hesitated for a moment at the front door, but there was no turning back now. She had to know the truth. The door creaked open as Alice pushed against it, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. The air inside smelled stale, as though it had not been disturbed in years. Dust motes floated in the sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows, and the once grand staircase at the far end of the hall seemed to be falling apart. She walked carefully, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor, until she reached the library. It was the one place in the mansion that always seemed to hold a certain comfort. It had been her great-grandfather's favorite room, and many of the family's secrets were said to be hidden among the old bookshelves. Alice approached the far wall, where a large, ornate bookshelf stood. Something about it seemed out of place, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding something. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her eyes searching for any clue as to what might lie behind the shelf. Then at last, her hand brushed against a small hidden lamp. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there.
With a soft click, the bookshelf shifted, revealing a narrow passageway that led into the darkness. The air that emanated from the passage was colder than the rest of the house, and a faint, musty odor filled her nostrils. It was as though the passage had been sealed off for years, waiting for someone to find it. With a mixture of fear and determination, Alice stepped into the darkened passage, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls were lined with stone, and the floor was uneven, as if it had been carved hastily. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, the silence growing heavier with each step. And then she saw it. At the end of the tunnel, there was a door. Unlike the rest of the house, this door was made of solid iron, and its surface was covered in strange markings that Alice could not decipher. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she twisted it. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a hidden room that Alice had never seen before. The walls were lined with shelves, but there were no books here, only old weathered artifacts and strange relics. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, and on it a single object, a small, intricately carved box. It was made of dark wood, its surface polished to a gleaming shine. The box seemed to hum with an energy that sent a shiver down Alice's spine. She stepped forward, drawn to the box as if by some unseen force. Her fingers brushed against the surface, and the hum grew louder, almost as if it were calling to her. With a sense of dread, Alice lifted the box, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing a bundle of old letters, their edges yellowed with age. The letters were tied together with a red ribbon, and as Alice untied it, she felt a wave of unease wash over her. She unfolded the first letter, its handwriting elegant but hurried. The words were dark, and they sent a chill through her bones as she read them. To my descendants, if you are reading this, then you have already crossed the line. The curse that binds us is not one to be broken lightly. It is tied to our very blood, and no Van Horn will escape it without great cost. I pray that you will find the strength to do what must be done, for the price of inaction is far worse than any sacrifice you may face. Our souls are bound to this house, and to the entity that feeds on our lineage. There is only one way to escape it. Alice stopped reading, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew, even before she finished the letter, that the truth she had feared was now staring her in the face. The Van Horns had made a deal with a powerful entity, one that had promised them wealth and power, but at the cost of their souls. She continued reading, her hands shaking as she unfolded the rest of the letter. Each one revealed more details about the pact, about the generations of Van Horns who had lived and died by the curse. But the final letter was the most chilling of all. It was written in her great-grandfather's hand, and it detailed how the family had attempted to break the curse, but all their efforts had failed, and in the end, they had only deepened the curse's grip on their bloodline. Alice's eyes widened as she read the final words. "The last Van Horn will be the one to break the curse, but the price will be more than you can bear. There is no escape, only darkness awaits." Alice stood in the hidden chamber, the last letter, from her great-grandfather, clenched tightly in her hands. Her heart thudded in her chest, the words she had just read echoing in her mind. Only darkness awaits. That chilling conclusion left no room for doubt. The curse had claimed every member of her family before her, and now it seemed it was her turn. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the mansion were closing in around her. The hidden room felt suffocating, the air thick with centuries of secrets. The box she had discovered was not just a collection of old letters, but a key to something far darker, a legacy of blood, power, and betrayal. Alice's fingers trembled as she set the final letter down on the stone altar. Her great-grandfather's words were clear. The price of breaking the curse would be more than she could bear. Yet, deep inside, she felt a pull, a force compelling her to confront the truth, to do what none of her ancestors had been able to do. The question was, what was the price, and was she willing to pay it? A loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, shaking Alice from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew the house well enough to recognize that it had no life of its own. There was nothing left here, not even echoes of but the sound. It was unmistakable. It was coming from beneath her feet. Panic set in, and for a moment, she was frozen. Was it the entity her family had bound themselves to centuries ago? Had it come to claim her now, just as it had claimed everyone else before her? Alice quickly grabbed the box and the letters, shoving them into her satchel. She needed answers, the kind that only the mansion itself could provide. The old building had always been a maze of rooms, staircases and hidden passages. It seemed to have been designed with secrets in mind, and Alice had a growing sense that the answers to her questions lay somewhere deep within its bowels. The mansion's winding corridors led her back toward the main staircase. As she descended, the air grew colder, heavier. The sound that had frightened her earlier grew louder, more insistent, as though something was moving just out of reach, brushing against the walls of the house like an ancient spirit, seeking release. The staircase creaked beneath her feet. As Alice reached the lower level, the atmosphere was thick with darkness, and the farther she ventured into the mansion, the more oppressive the air became. She passed rooms that seemed abandoned, their walls stained with age, but none that offered the answers she sought. Finally, she reached the basement door, the one place her family had avoided for generations. It had always been locked, sealed tight, just as the rest of the mansion's dark corners had been. Alice's pulse quickened as she stood before it, her fingers brushing the cold iron handle. This is it, she thought, the heart of it all. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and stepped into the dimly lit basement. The space was cavernous, the walls lined with old shelves covered in dust and cobweb. But it wasn't the shelves that caught her attention. It was the dark corner of the room where something was different. There, in the farthest reaches of the basement, lay a large wooden door, its edges darkened with time and decay. It was unlike anything else in the room. No dust, no cobwebs. It looked new, too new for a house this old. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the door. She had never seen it before, but something about it felt familiar, as though it had been waiting for her to find it. The closer she got, the more the room seemed to hum with energy, as if the very air was vibrating with anticipation. Alice's breath caught in her throat as she reached out and touched the door. It was warm to the touch, almost alive. With trembling hands, she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that descended into deeper darkness. The air that rushed from the passage was heavy and stale, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth, and something else, something metallic, like blood. Without thinking, Alice stepped forward, her footsteps echoing through the narrow corridor as she descended. The further she went, the colder it became, and then just as she thought she could go no further, the passage opened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with stone. In the center of the room stood an altar, but this was no ordinary altar.
It was a slab of black stone engraved with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Around it were 4 tall pillars, each adorned with a different symbol. Alice recognized them immediately from the letters. They were the sigils of the Van Horn bloodline, the heir. In the room grew thick with a sense of dread. As Alice moved closer to the altar, her heart raced, and for a moment, she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. But then, she saw it. A large book bound in dark leather lay open on the altar. It was covered in dust, as though it had not been touched for years. But the moment Alice approached, the pages seemed to turn of their own accord, as though the book were alive, or waiting for her to arrive. Her hand shook as she reached out to touch the book. The moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air crackled with energy, and the symbols on the pillars began to glow bright. Alice quickly flipped through the pages, each one filled with strange writings and diagrams that made her head spin. Then, in the center of the book, she found it, the final entry. It was written in a script she could barely understand, but the message was clear. The curse cannot be broken without sacrifice. The bloodline must be cleansed. Only then will the entity be vanquished. But the price will be steep: 1 life, 1 soul, in exchange for freedom. Alice's breath caught in her throat. The sacrifice. It was her. She had known it all along. The price of breaking the curse was her very life. As she read the words again, a deep sense of calm washed over her. She understood now. The curse had followed her family for generations, but she was the one who could end it. She had always been the one to bear the burden, the one destined to sacrifice everything for the sake of her bloodline. But even as she accepted her fate, she felt a presence in the room with her. Something ancient, something powerful. She turned around, and there, standing at the edge of the shadows, was the figure of a man. His eyes were black, empty pits, and his face was twisted in a grotesque smile. The entity. Alice took a step back, her heart pounding. It had come for her, just as the letters had said, but now she was ready. Alice stood frozen in the dim, ancient chamber, staring at the entity that had plagued her family for centuries. It was as if time itself had slowed to a crawl, the air thick with tension. The entity, draped in shadow and dark energy, loomed over the altar, its form ever-changing, like smoke that refused to dissipate. Its eyes, black as the abyss, fixed on her with a gaze that pierced through her very soul. For a moment, she wondered if the letters had been right all along. Was this the price her ancestors had paid? And now, in her final hour, was she ready to make the ultimate sacrifice? Her fingers still trembled as they gripped the book, the one that held the key to ending the curse. The words inside were clear: the sacrifice of 1 life, 1 soul, in exchange for freedom. Her breath hitched as she realized the implications. The air in the chamber felt colder now, and the dark whispers seemed to grow louder, pressing in on.
But the price had been paid. She could feel it, a deep ache in her soul, a sacrifice made to free her bloodline. The weight of that sacrifice hung heavily on her heart. She had saved her family, but at what cost? She stood in the silent chamber, the echoes of the past fading into nothingness. The mansion, once filled with darkness and torment, now stood silent. The curse that had plagued her family for so long finally lifted. But Alice knew the true cost. The entity might be gone, but the sacrifice she had made would echo through time, forever marking her as the one who broke the chains, the one who ended the bloodline's torment. And as she turned to leave the chamber, the weight of her actions settled in. She had freed her family, she had broken the curse, but in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. Alice stood in the aftermath of her actions, the weight of what she had just done sinking deep into her chest. The mansion around her, once a fortress of terror and shadow, now felt oddly still, as if the very air had settled into an unnatural calm. Yet even in the silence, Alice could feel the echoes of her family's dark history pressing against her, a weight too heavy to escape. As she walked through the crumbling halls of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The walls, once alive with whispers, now seemed to breathe in the quiet. The house had been a prison for so long, its dark presence a constant reminder of the curse that had haunted her family for generations. But now that the entity had been vanquished, the mansion was not empty of its memory. No, the memories of the curse, the sacrifices, the bloodline, they lingered, as though woven into the very fabric of the house itself. Alice could feel it. The loss, the emptiness, the void left by the destruction of the curse. She had done what her ancestors couldn't. She had broken the bloodline's chains, but in doing so, Alice had severed something deeper. The connection between her family and the mansion was more than just a curse. It was their identity, their legacy. Now, with the curse lifted, Alice found herself wondering what was left. What had she truly sacrificed? The mansion, which had once felt like a trap, now seemed like a tomb of memories, of pain, of a bloodline that had existed for centuries, plagued by its own dark secret. As Alice walked through the dust-covered halls, her eyes fixed on the faded portraits hanging on the walls, faces she had never met, yet faces that seemed strangely familiar. They were her family, her ancestors, all the ones who had lived before her, all the ones who had suffered. And yet, even as the weight of the mansion's history pressed on her, Alice couldn't help but feel something else. A sense of liberation. The curse was gone. The bloodline's torment had ended. She had freed them all. But in doing so, she had freed herself as well. Her mind was finally clear, free of the haunting whispers and promises of power that had once dominated her every thought. But the freedom didn't come without its price. As Alice reached the center of the mansion, her gaze fell upon the altar once more. The altar where the curse had been broken. It was now nothing more than a cold, empty stone, devoid of the dark energy that had once surged from it. But even in its emptiness, Alice could feel the lingering presence of what had transpired here. The energy of the curse still hung in the air, like the remnants of a storm that had just passed. She took a deep breath, her hand shaking slightly as she reached out to touch the altar. As her fingers brushed against the cold stone, a sudden realization hit her. The curse had been lifted, but the darkness had not completely disappeared. It was still there, in the shadows, in the memories, in the very walls of the mansion. Alice was free, but freedom came with the knowledge that some things could never be fully erased. The Van Horn legacy, the family's dark past, would always be a part of her. It would always be a part of the mansion. And perhaps that was the greatest sacrifice of all, the knowledge that even in breaking the curse, Alice could never fully escape the darkness that had shaped her bloodline. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought she had seen something, someone, standing in the doorway. But when she turned to look, the doorway was empty, the house too silent, too still. Shaking her head, Alice forced herself to take a step forward. It was over. The curse had ended. The entity was gone. The family was free. But as she stepped away from the altar, the shadows seemed to shift, to darken once more. Alice felt a chill run down her spine, a whisper in the air, a faint trace of something she couldn't quite place. It was as if the mansion itself was holding on to something from the past, something that refused to be forgotten. The last remnants of the Van Horn curse still clung to the mansion, to Alice, and to the bloodline. And no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, pulling her back into the darkness. The weight of Alice's decision lingered in the air like a thick fog. The mansion, once a prison of torment and despair, had taken on an eerie silence after the curse was broken. Yet, despite her apparent triumph, a lingering unease refused to leave her heart. She had freed her family from the clutches of the dark entity that had cursed them for generations. But as the days passed,
Alice began to wonder if she had truly severed the last threads of her bloodline's cursed past. Her questions seemed to spiral in the darkness of the mansion. Was it truly over? Was the bloodline now cleansed? Or was there something more lurking, waiting to reclaim what had been taken from it? The walls, once filled with whispers and shadows, felt hollow, empty. The air had changed, but it felt like a brief calm before the storm. That is, until the letter arrived. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges. It was sealed with the Van Horn family crest, the same crest that had adorned the family's coat of arms for generations. Alice felt a shiver run down her spine as she turned the letter over in her hands. She hadn't seen this seal in years, and she certainly hadn't expected it to make an appearance now after everything that had transpired. She tore open the letter with trembling fingers, her heart pounding in her chest. As she unfolded the parchment, her eyes scanned the words quickly, as if fearing they would vanish before she could read them. To Alice Van Horn, heir to the bloodline, it is with great sorrow and urgency that I write to you. Your actions, though noble, have not gone unnoticed. The curse that has bound our family for generations is not so easily broken. It is still watching, still lingering, and it will not rest until it has claimed its due. There is a price for what you have done, and it is a price only I can help you pay. Come to the old estate, come, and I will show you the truth about the curse and the Van Horn bloodline. It is not over. Not yet. The letter was signed with a name Alice had not heard in years. Roderick Van Horn. A name from the past. A name tied to the family's darkest secret. Roderick was Alice's cousin, the last known heir to the family fortune, the one who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. No one had ever spoken of him again after his disappearance. Alice had always assumed he had died, but this letter spoke of something else entirely. Alice's hands trembled as she placed the letter down, her mind racing. Roderick was alive. The Van Horn heir, the one who had vanished so long ago, was alive. But why was he contacting her now? And why had he waited until after the curse was broken to reveal himself? The mansion, once silent and still, suddenly felt alive again. Alice could feel the tension building, the pulse of something ancient stirring in the shadow. She could almost hear the whispers again, faint at first, then louder, like a warning. She had no choice but to go. Whatever this was, whatever Roderick wanted, it was a part of her family's history, and it was clear that the story was far from over. Alice packed her things in a haze, her mind a storm of confusion and dread. The journey to the old estate was long and grueling, the road winding through dense forest, leading her to the very heart of her family's legacy. As Alice approached the gates of the mansion, her heart raced. The air felt thick with the weight of centuries, and the house loomed before her, dark and imposing. She could feel the house watching her, waiting for her return. The windows, once sealed tight, were now cracked open, as if inviting her. The gates, which had been locked for years, were now slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. As Alice stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over her. The house felt different, but familiar. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor creaked under her weight, and the scent of dust and decay filled the air. But it wasn't just the house that felt different. Alice could feel a presence, something that had been waiting for her, something that knew she was coming. And then she saw him. Roderick Van Horn stood at the top of the grand staircase, his silhouette dark against the dim light of the hallway. His eyes glimmered with something Alice couldn't quite place, something ancient, something far too knowing. "Alice," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying an eerie calm. "I knew you would come. You always were the curious one." "Roderick," Alice replied, her voice trembling slightly. Why now? Why after everything that happened?" Roderick smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think you've broken the curse, don't you? That you've freed our bloodline. But what you don't realize, Alice, is that the curse is not something you can simply destroy. It's not just a shadow, not just a dark force that can be banished with a single act. No, the curse is a part of us, a part of the Van Horn legacy. It's in our blood, and it will never truly let us go. Alice stared at him, trying to process his words. What do you mean? You're saying it's not over? Roderick nodded, stepping down the stairs toward her. No, Alice. It's just beginning. Alice stood frozen at the foot of the grand staircase, her eyes locked on Roderick. His words echoed in her ears, drowning out the silence of the mansion. The curse is in our blood, he had said. It will never truly let us go. She took a hesitant step forward, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. For years, Alice had believed the curse had been broken, that the family's dark history was finally over, that she could live in peace. But standing before her now, Roderick had shattered that illusion. She hadn't freed them, she had merely delayed the inevitable. Roderick, what are you talking about? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean by the curse being in our blood? What happened to the family? Why are you here now? Roderick chuckled softly, a low, haunting sound that seemed to reverberate through the empty halls of the mansion. Ah, Alice, always the skeptic, always seeking answers, even when the truth is staring you in the face. I should have known you'd come to find me. You've always been the curious one, haven't you? Alice clenched her fists at her sides. I don't care about your riddles, Roderick. Just tell me the truth. What happened to our family? What did you do? For the first time, Roderick's smile faltered. His expression grew serious, almost grim. He stepped closer to Alice, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the mansion. The Van Horn family, he began slowly, was never just a wealthy, influential family. Our name, our bloodline, has always been tied to something darker, something ancient. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard whispers of dark family secrets, tales of curses, and ancient rituals, but she had never truly believed them. They were just stories, old legends meant to frighten children, weren't they? Roderick continued, his voice steady but cold. Our ancestors made a pact, Alice, a pact with something beyond this world. You sought power, wealth and immortality, but at a terrible cost. They made a deal with an entity, a force that thrived on suffering, on fear, and on control. It was no mere superstition, it was real, and the curse that followed us was the price of that deal. Alice shook her head, refusing to believe what she was hearing. No, that can't be true. Our family, our ancestors wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have made a deal with something evil. Roderick's eyes darkened, his gaze hardening. You think you know our family's history, Alice, but you don't. You don't understand the lengths to which our ancestors were willing to go. They were desperate, hungry for power, and the entity they made the deal with gave them what they wanted: wealth, influence and protection from death. But there was a price that couldn't be paid in gold or land. No, the price was our souls. The blood of the Van Horn family was stained the moment they made that pact. Alice took a step back, her heart pounding. She had always thought of her family as strong, noble, but now she realized the terrible truth. Her ancestors hadn't just been cursed by fate, they had knowingly invited the curse upon themselves. Roderick saw the disbelief in her eyes and pressed on. The curse, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, wasn't just about death or misfortune. It was a parasite, feeding on the very essence of our bloodline. It lured us in, made us crave more power, more control, until we were no longer humans. We became its servants, its vessels, and the more we resisted, the more the curse took. Alice's knees wobbled as the weight of his words settled in. The curse wasn't just some family myth. It was the very reason for her family's downfall. It was why her ancestors had grown paranoid, reclusive, and ultimately self-destructive. And now, it was why she stood there, facing the last surviving member of her bloodline, the one who had been consumed by it all. But why now? Alice asked, her voice shaking. Why come back now? Roderick, if you know all this, if you've been living with it, why didn't you tell anyone soon? Roderick's face softened for a moment, a flicker of regret crossing his features. Because I couldn't, he said quietly. The curse had a hold on me, just as it had on them. It made sure I stayed hidden, kept me locked away in the shadow. But I couldn't stand by and watch you destroy everything. Alice, I couldn't let you think you had broken it, when it was never broken to begin with.
Alice felt a pang of guilt. She had thought she was freeing her family, liberating them from the curse that had haunted them for generations, but instead she had merely delayed the inevitable. The curse had followed them all along, lying in wait, patient and unyielding. And now, she asked, her voice barely audible, "What do we do now?" Roderick's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Alice saw something like fear in his gaze. "Now we face it, Alice. We face the darkness that we've been running from for so long. We face the entity that controls us, the one that has always been behind the curse. It's not over. It's never been over. And unless we do something about it now, the curse will claim us all." A chill swept through Alice's body. As the weight of his words sank in, she thought of her family, of the generations before her who had suffered, and of the bloodline that had been doomed by its own choices. And then she realized she was the last one left, the last Van Horn. The air in the mansion grew heavier, the walls pressing in around her. The curse was not a thing of the past. It was alive, waiting, watching, and it would not stop until it had claimed every last Van Horn. Alice had only one choice. She would have to face the darkness, no matter what it cost. Alice had always believed the Van Horn family to be strong, full of integrity and honor, but now, as she stood at the precipice of her family's ultimate secret, she felt the ground beneath her tremble. The curse wasn't just a shadow over her Heather's past. It was a living, breathing force that had shaped every aspect of her life. Roderick had left her with no easy answers. Instead, he had opened a door to a past she wasn't ready to confront. He had told her they needed to face the entity that had controlled their bloodline, the one that had orchestrated the destruction of her ancestors. But how could she fight something so ancient, so powerful? She stood in the grand library of the mansion, her fingers tracing the worn pages of an old leather-bound journal that had been passed down through generations of Van Horns. It had once belonged to her great-great-grandfather, and inside it were cryptic entries that spoke of strange rituals, forbidden pacts, and the price of power. The deeper Alice read, the more she understood the truth. Her family had made a terrible mistake, and now it was up to her to rectify it. As she scanned the pages, her heart pounded. The ritual her ancestors had performed had been meant to secure the Van Horn's power and wealth, but instead, it had bound them to an entity, a being whose hunger for control had never been satisfied. It was not a simple curse, but a contract, one forged in blood and dark magic. The more Alice read, the clearer it became. This entity thrived on manipulation, fear and suffering. It fed on the bloodline, claiming each member as its own. It whispered into their ears, urging them to seek more wealth, more influence, more power, and the more they gave, the tighter its grip became. Over the centuries, the Van Horns had become slaves to their own desires, unable to break free. She had always wondered why her family had been so obsessed with secrecy, why they kept to the shadows, why they seemed so terrified of the outside world. Now she knew they had been running from this very darkness. The entity they had made a deal with had never left them. It had simply waited for the right moment to strike. It had been controlling them from the very beginning, using their greed and ambition to keep them tethered to its will. But now, as Alice stood at the crossroads of fate, she knew one thing for sure: the time for running was over. A cold gust of wind swept through the library. Though the windows were tightly shut, Alice's breath caught in her throat. She felt a presence, the presence that had been lurking in the corners of her mind since Roderick had revealed the truth. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, and then she saw it, a shadow, flickering at the edges of her vision. It was as if something was watching her, something ancient and hungry. The air grew heavier, the walls of the mansion seeming to close in around her. The curse was awakening again, just as Roderick had warned. It was no longer a distant force. It was here now, in the very room with her. Alice's heart raced. As she tried to steady her breathing, the shadow seemed to shift, becoming more solid,
more tangible. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace. Its presence felt more than seen. She knew what it was. She knew what it had been all along. The entity that had plagued her family for centuries had come for her. "Are you ready to face me?" a voice whispered, cold and rasping, like the sound of leaves scraping across stone. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the walls, vibrating through her very bones. "You think you can break the chains that bind your bloodline? You are nothing but a vessel, Alice, just like your ancestors before you." Alice's knees threatened to buckle, but she stood her ground. She could feel the entity's power growing stronger, its dark influence pressing down on her, trying to crush her will, but she refused to succumb. She would not be its pawn. She would not let it destroy her. "No," Alice said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I won't let you control me. You won't control my family anymore." The shadow seemed to pause as if considering her words. Then the voice came again, this time slower, more mocking. "You think you can fight me? You think you can defy the fate that has been written for you? Your bloodline is mine, Alice. It always has been." But Alice was done running. She had seen the destruction that had been wrought on her family, seen the suffering they had endured because of this curse, and she knew, deep down, that she was the last hope, the last chance to break the cycle. She could feel the power of her ancestors rising within her, their strength, their resolve, their determination to end the darkness that had consumed them for so long. "I am not my ancestors," Alice said, her voice gaining strength. "I am not the slave to your will. I will not be your vessel. I will break the curse, and I will free my bloodline from you forever." The shadow seemed to recoil at her words, a momentary flicker of hesitation passing through it. For the first time, Alice felt as if she had gained some control over the situation, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. This entity was powerful, ancient, and merciless. It wouldn't go down without a fight. But Alice had made her choice. She would not let her family's legacy be defined by fear and suffering. She would face the darkness head-on, no matter what it took. The mansion seemed to shake around her, the walls groaning as if the very structure was alive, writhing with the energy of the curse. But Alice stood firm, her heart steady, her resolve unshaken. "This ends tonight," she whispered, her voice ringing out with an unwavering certainty. "The Van Horn family will be free." The shadow hesitated for a moment longer, and then, with a sound like a gust of wind, it vanished, leaving the room, eerily silent. The air, once thick with darkness, now felt lighter, though the weight of the curse still lingered in the corners of her mind. Alice took a deep breath, her pulse racing. She had confronted the entity, she had faced the darkness, but she knew that the battle wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done, still much to uncover about the origins of the curse and how to finally break it. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was in control. She was no longer running from the past, and that, she realized, was the first step toward freedom. Alice stood at the threshold of the mansion's hidden vault, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of her family's dark history pressed down on her shoulders like a 1,000-pound stone. She had come so far, and yet, the final step seemed almost impossible. The entity, the source of the curse that had plagued the Van Horn bloodline for generations, lay just beyond this door. Her mind flashed back to the countless hours spent poring over ancient tomes, deciphering cryptic symbols, and speaking with the ghosts of her ancestors who had suffered before her. But now, it was time to confront the truth once and for all. This was the moment that would either break the curse, or damn her family forever. The mansion had seemed so alive when she first arrived, its corridors echoing with whispers of the past. The rooms felt like they were watching her, waiting for her to discover what lay hidden beneath the veneer of wealth and grandeur. For so long, the Van Horns had carried their secrets with pride, never daring to face the consequences of their actions. But Alice was different. She had been born to break the chains, to confront the darkness head-on. With trembling hands she reached for the cold brass handle of the vault door, her fingers lingering for a moment, as though to summon the courage she needed. She had learned the truth about her family's past, the deals they had made, the blood sacrifices they had offered to the entity that had twisted their lives. But knowing the truth, and facing it were two very different things. With a deep breath, Alice turned the handle and pushed the door open. The vault creaked, the sound reverberating through the room like a living thing. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of old books and forgotten memories filled her nose. The walls were lined with shelves upon shelves of ancient artifacts, but what caught her attention was the center of the room. In the middle, a pedestal stood, draped in a black cloth. As Alice stepped forward, she felt a chill run down her spine. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the very presence of the entity was drawing closer. She reached out and pulled the cloth away. There, resting in the center of the pedestal, was a small, ornate box. It was old, its wood worn and cracked from centuries of neglect. The carvings on its surface seemed to shimmer, as if alive. It was a box that had been passed down through generations, a box that held the key to her family's curse. The blood of her ancestors had sealed it, and now it was up to Alice to unseal it. She hesitated. Could she truly face what was inside? Could she bear the weight of her family's sins, the choices they had made, the blood they had spilled to keep their power? But then, she remembered the faces of her ancestors, the ones who had suffered in silence, the ones who had begged for freedom but never got it. Alice was their last hope. She could not turn back now. With a deep breath, she reached for the box. As her fingers touched the surface, a jolt of energy shot through her. Like an electric shock, the box seemed to pulse, the carvings glowing faintly in the dim light of the vault. Alice's vision blurred, and she stumbled back, gripping the edge of the pedestal for support. Her heart raced, and she felt a coldness in the pit of her stomach. Then she heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering from within the box. It was a voice that sounded like the very earth itself, ancient and knowing. You think you can break the chain, child? You think you can free them? Alice's blood ran cold as the voice filled her mind. It was the entity, the one that had been pulling the strings for centuries. She could feel its power, its presence, all around her. I've come for you, Alice said, her voice trembling but resolute. And I will end this curse. You will no longer control my family. The voice laughed, a deep, cruel sound that echoed through her mind. You are but a child of your bloodline. You are weak, just as they were. The curse is eternal. You cannot break it. Alice closed her eyes, gathering every ounce of strength within her. She had learned the truth, and now it was time to act. She had spent her life running from this moment, hiding in the shadows of her family's past, but no longer. She would not let the darkness win. She placed her hand firmly on the box and whispered a prayer she had learned from the journals of her ancestors. It was a prayer of power, of release, a prayer to sever the ties that had bound her family to the entity for so long. The box began to shake, its carvings glowing brighter, the energy within it swirling like a storm. The voice inside grew louder, more frantic, but Alice stood her ground. She was no longer afraid. With a final, deafening roar, the box exploded in a burst of light, sending shockwaves through the vault. Alice was thrown back, her body slamming against the stone wall. She gasped for air, her vision blurred. The room spun around her as the energy from the box seemed to rip through the air. And then, suddenly, it was silent. Alice lay on the ground, her body aching, her chest rising and falling with every shallow breath. She opened her eyes, and for the first time she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The curse was gone. The entity had been vanquished. The mansion no longer felt alive. The shadows had lifted, and the weight that had hung over her family for so long was gone. The Van Horns were free. But Alice knew this wasn't the end. The journey had been long, and it had cost her more than she could ever repay. Her family's secrets had been exposed. The darkness had been faced, and now it was time to rebuild. She stood up, her legs unsteady but strong. She had done it. She had broken the curse. As Alice walked out of the vault, she glanced back one final time. The mansion, once a place of fear and suffering, now stood silent, its doors open to the world outside. And as she stepped into the light, she whispered a final prayer for her ancestors, for her family, and for the generations that would come after. The Van Horn bloodline was free, and its future was no longer bound by darkness. This is the end of Alice's story, but the journey for the truth never ends. Join us in uncovering more mysteries, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The secrets of the past are waiting to be revealed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seat.